Masechet Yevamot, Daf Vav. We are looking for a source to argue that a misvat aseh can override a misvat lo ta'aseh, even if the lo ta'aseh is a powerful one and would have a punishment of karet. We tried a few things. We tried Brit Milah, Pesach, and Tamid, and those didn't work. We tried the idea of honoring parents would override Shabbat if a parent says to violate Shabbat, and we already rejected that. We're going to try two more possibilities today. The idea that building the Beit haMikdash, which is a mitzvah, would override Shabbat, if not for a derasha. We're going to reject that. And then we're going to lastly try capital punishment. Can a bet din kill a convict on Shabbat? And over there also, it would override Shabbat, if not for a derasha. And so we're going to reject this one also. So in the end of the daf today, we're still going to be left without a source for this. Why are we looking for a source for this? Because we have a baraita that says the word aleha in Yibum and the prohibition of erva regarding two sisters, and we weren't sure which one should override the other. And aleha tells us that the prohibition overrides the positive commandment. And so this assumes, why do you need a derasha, the extra word of aleha, to teach us that? It must be that if not for the derasha, we would have assumed otherwise. We would have assumed that misvat aseh of Yibum doche lo ta'aseh, that even has karet of the erva of marrying two sisters. So this derasha only makes sense if we have the assumption that aseh over lo ta'aseh, even if it has karet. So that's why we're looking for a proof, a source that this rule is in effect. If we don't have a source for this rule, then we have to go back and wonder, why do you even need the word aleha? I would just know it on my own, that the lo ta'aseh with karet would be more powerful than aseh. Okay, so in the meantime, we already established that aseh is doche, a regular lo ta'aseh. That's from the fact that sisit overrides shatnez, which is one without karet. But this is going to come into play also today in this discussion. Okay, so let's go right back into the honoring parents and remember where we were, because we're going to pick up on it. And so we mentioned that honoring parents, it says, Ish imov aviv tirau betotai tishmoru. This pasuk comes to teach that if a parent asks a child to violate Shabbat, for example, says, go make me a steak, then the child should not do it. And I only know that because I have the derasha. If not for the derasha, I would have thought that honoring parents does override Shabbat. So that would be a source. However, we answered that baraita isn't necessarily talking about a case of a full-fledged melacha, like go and kill an animal, but maybe just mechamer. If the father asked me to drive a laden animal, that is a melacha that does not get karet. And so therefore, I could not learn from there that if not for the derasha, it would override a lav with karet, because this is not a lav that has karet. All I could learn from here is that if not for the derasha, if my father asked me to drive a laden animal, which is just a regular lav, then I would assume I would listen to my father, right? If not for the derasha, that comes and teaches me the opposite. So therefore, that we can't learn anything about a karet law. All right, now that you have this, this is gonna cause a problem to the thing we already established. I thought we already established that aseh is doche, a regular law ta'aseh from sisit. But now, once you have this derasha, that might actually teach me the opposite regarding even that regular case. So maybe I should actually learn from here. I was trying to learn a powerful case. Now this is actually going to even undo the regular case. So I'll learn from here that when we said before, aseh is doche lo ta'aseh, we could learn from here that the opposite, that an aseh is not doche, even a regular lo ta'aseh, because after all, in this case, I do not listen to my father who tells me to drive a laden animal, and so this regular lo ta'aseh overrides the aseh. Okay, so now we know we thought we were doing something good. Now we're undoing the whole arguments that we had for the past 2 days. Okay, so we'll try to answer it. Maybe you'll tell me, oh, Shabbat is a very stringent. I mean, to be Shomer Shabbat, Shabbat is an ot, and maybe that's why Shabbat overrides honoring parents. But I can't learn from this to other cases like sisit or whatever. So maybe you'll say that, but that would not be a good argument because the following Braita is going to be talking about regular cases and it's going to compare it to Shabbat. And it's not going to say, oh, Shabbat is more machmir. Let's see what this Braita is. The Tanya. Yachol amar lo aviv, hitameh, o shamar lo al tachzir. For example, if a father tells a Kohen or a Nazir, his son, go and become tameh. Maybe he forgot something in a cemetery. And he tells the son, please do me a favor and go get me that thing from the cemetery. Or if, let's say a son finds something. He finds some money or an item. And the father said, and he has a mitzvah to return it. And the father says, don't return it. I want you to keep it. Or I want you to give it to me. So, Yachol Yishma Lo. So, does the mitzvah of honoring a father override these mitzvot? Talmud Lomar, Ish Amo ve'aviv tirau ve'et Shabbatot tishmoru. Kolechem chayavin bichvodi. So, this pasuk that says, you have to honor your parents, it's true, but you also have to keep Shabbat. So, since everybody is required to honor God, even the parents, therefore, one does not honor the parents if they tell a person to violate any mitzvah. Now, we're comparing mitzvah of not becoming tameh and of returning a lost item to Shabbat. And we don't say here, wait a second, Shabbat is more machmir. Only Shabbat will override honoring parents, not anything else. We don't say that. So you see that we treat Shabbat on an equal level to everything else. And therefore, you can't tell me over here that, oh, Shabbat is more machmir. There's no way to get out of that. So we're back to our question, which is that in this case, my father says to go drive a laden donkey. I'm supposed to not do that and disobey kibud avim. And so once again, how come we don't learn from here that it's the lo ta'aseh that is doche, the aseh of honoring parents? And so here's the answer. Ela mishum diga lemifrach malehanach sheken hechsher mitzvah. Okay, that case is different because if my father says to go and violate Shabbat, the honoring parents is only the mitzvah itself is really only making sure to feed and clothe my parents, make sure they're taken care of. And so if my father says, do something else to violate Shabbat, that violation of Shabbat is not directly what my father asked me to do. Rather, it's only a preparation for that. Hechsher mitzvah. The concept of hechsher mitzvah, a good example would be sukkah. The mitzvah is to sit in a sukkah on the holiday. Building a sukkah is not a mitzvah in and of itself, but I can't sit in a sukkah unless I build it. So building a sukkah is a hechsher mitzvah, is a preparation for it. So too, if my father would say, can you serve me a steak? The mitzvah is actually just serving the steak. Everything else I do before, going and catching the animal and doing shechita and all that, or bringing something to him by leading a donkey, all that is only a preparation for the mitzvah. And therefore, in this case, the aseh is actually a low level. So that's the reason here why the lo ta'aseh overrides, Shabbat overrides honoring parents, because it's not actually overriding honoring parents, it's only overriding the preparation for honoring parents. And that's why I would not be able to learn from this example to other examples that lo ta'aseh overrides an aseh. And so we're good. And we stick with the original thesis that aseh is doche lo ta'aseh. The problem is that we now still don't have a source that aseh is doche lo ta'aseh with karet. So now we're going to try our next proof. It's going to be similar to the previous one. Ela saka da'atech amina tete mibinyan bet haMikdash. Detanya yachol yehe binyan bet haMikdash doche Shabbat. Talmud lomar et shabbatotai tishmoru u'mikdashi tira'u kolechem chayavin bichvodi. There is a mitzvah to build the Beit HaMikdash now, or the Mishkan. And so can it be that building the Beit HaMikdash would override Shabbat, and I can build the Beit HaMikdash even on Shabbat. That's why the pasuk comes and compares them back to back and says, keep Shabbat and also fear my Mikdash. That since everyone is obligated in God's honor, therefore on Shabbat we do not build the Beit HaMikdash. Right? I'm the one that told you to build the Beit HaMikdash. I'm also the one that said not on Shabbat. Good. So now we see that the misvat. We have a derasha here. The point is that we need this derasha. If let's say we didn't have the derasha of these two concepts back to back, then my assumption would be that the misvat aseh of building Beit HaMikdash would override Shabbat, even though Shabbat has karet. So this is the source. It's true, we don't actually do it, but only because of the derasha. So we can learn that without the derasha, we do have the rule. And so now, what cases are talking about? What violation would happen if you're building a Beit HaMikdash? You're building and demolishing in order to build, right? That's part of the process. You have to take something down in order to put something else better in its place. And so this is a full-fledged melacha that would have karet. And the only reason we don't do it on Shabbat is because the pasuk said so. This pasuk said so. Extra pasuk that added these words. But if not, the aseh of building the Beit HaMikdash would override the lo ta'aseh, even though it has karet. Good. Now we have a source for the rule. But then we reject this because not necessarily. This is all a braita, but we don't know. The braita doesn't specify what case it's talking about. We assumed it's talking about building, but maybe not. Lav the mechamed. Maybe it's only the prohibition of driving a laden animal. You're just bringing some material to the site by leading an animal, but that is not a chiyuv karet. And nevertheless, even though it's not a lav with karet, nevertheless, this derasha is teaching us that you cannot do even that on Shabbat. You have to stop altogether from all melacha, even without karet. Okay, so there you go. Since it's not a mitzvah, this is not a violation of the derasha with karet, so therefore I cannot learn and I cannot learn our rule. All right. Oh well. But now we're going to have the same opposite problem that we just had with the previous example. Wait, that which we already established from Sisit and Shatnez, that a regular mitzvah taseh overrides a regular lo taseh. From here, we can learn the opposite, because once we have this derasha, we learn from this derasha that lava mechamer, which is just a regular lav, overrides misvat aseh of building the Beit HaMikdash. And so here I would have an example of the opposite of the sisit, and this would undo everything we've established even before. Okay, the rest is going to be very similar to what we saw above. And maybe you'll sort of tell me, over here, the Shabbat overrides Aseh because Shabbat is such an important thing, right? It's an ot and all that. No, I have an next braita where Shabbat is compared to other things in the world, and no one says, Shabbat is more machmir. See, this is not something that is used in a prior legal discussion. So what is that? If a father tells a son to go become tameh if he's a kohen or a nazir, or if he tells him don't return a lost object, so we're learning from the mitzvah of Shabbat that just like if your father says to violate Shabbat, you don't listen to him, so too if he tells you to violate any of these laws, you don't listen to him. Because everyone, even the parents, have to honor God. So you see that the Baraita is comparing Shabbat to other mitzvot and doesn't say Shabbat is more machmir. So you can't tell me that this case is different because Shabbat is more machmir. Rather, rather, the reason why we're not going to undo the rule from this is because in this case, when the father asks to do, no, in this case, when the Torah says to build the Beit HaMikdash, It's only when you're going and leading an animal or doing other things, you're not actually building the Beit HaMikdash. It's only a hechsher mitzvah. You're only bringing some material to the site. And therefore, since it's not even a full-fledged mitzvah, that's why, in this case, Shabbat will override the building of the Beit HaMikdash. In other words, Shabbat overrides the preparation for building the Beit HaMikdash. And that's therefore, it makes perfect sense. And you cannot derive from here that if it was a full-fledged aseh, that it would still override. No, exactly the opposite. We maintain our rule from before that a full-fledged mitzvah like sisit does override a regular non-karet prohibition like shatnez, and so everything is back to normal. By the way, I explained that this section according to Rabbeinu Hananel, not according to Rashi, which you might find. Rashi is a lot more difficult here, and I think Rabbeinu Hananel reads much more smoothly. Okay, hechsher mitzvah tepok lemehatam. Okay, now that we have this doubling of an argument, we wonder, this rule that Shabbat overrides the preparation of a mitzvah, we already learned that from the case of honoring parents. I don't need this other second case regarding building the Beit HaMikdash to teach me the very same thing. So this pasuk cannot come just for that. So we know you're right. In hachinameh betchabetotai tishmoru mikdashi tirao lamali. Rather, this pasuk comparing Shabbat to building the Beit HaMikdash must be teaching something else. Okay, because we already know that from before. And so now we bring a different baraita that will use something else. In fact, this baraita and the previous one actually both found in Torat Kohanim, the Sifra, the Midrash on Sefer Vayikra, and they're right there back to back, which means probably in the Midrash, they assume that we could use the pasuk for more than one thing. You could learn lots of things from one pasuk. And the Talmud Bavli has the general methodology that you can only learn one thing from a pasuk. Every pasuk and its derivation and the derivation of a law has to have a one-to-one relationship, not a one-to-two relationship. So that's why the Bavli here is citing this as an alternative to the previous baraita. Okay, anyway, the point is that what are we going to do with this pasuk? Because we already know the rule that Shabbat is going to override a preparation for a mitzvah. So rather, the following baraita uses this pasuk for something else. It's really important. It's a really fascinating darasha here. Yachol yityareh adam mimikdash. When it says mikdashi tirau, you should fear the Beit HaMikdash. Does that mean you should actually fear and worship the stones and building of the Beit HaMikdash? In this case, in the Torah, it's referring to the referring to the Mishkan, and later on referring to the Beit HaMikdash. Talmud Omar, et Shabbatotai tishmoru, vet mat mikdashi tirau. Nemra shemira b'Shabbat, v'nemra mora b'Mikdash. So the Torah is comparing these two, and it says safeguard Shabbat and fear the Mikdash. Ma shemira mora b'Shabbat. When it says safeguard Shabbat, Shabbat is not an entity in and of itself. It's not a live being, a personality that you'd safeguard it, but rather the point is we should safeguard, we should fear he who commanded Shabbat, right? We are, by safeguarding Shabbat, that's an expression of our fear of heaven. Af mora hamora b'mikdash. So too, regarding the Mikdash, it's not that we have to be reverent of the stones of the Beit HaMikdash itself, but rather we have to be reverent of he who commanded us to build a Mikdash. Okay, so how do we do that? Okay, it's not about an attitude towards the stones, but rather how we use this space as holy space. Be'ezohi mora mikdash. Lo yikanes adam behar habayit b'maklo, b'min alo, b'fundato, u'ba'avak she'al gabe raglav, ve'lo yasena kapandria urkika mikal v'chomer. So the proper way to approach the Beit HaMikdash is not to instrumentalize it, not to use it for our own personal gain. This is in a way a definition of what it means to be holy. Something holy is separated, set aside for special use, for tefillah, for Torah, for holy things, and not for our own personal gain, and should be treated with respect. And therefore, for example, you don't go to haMikdash holding with your walking staff or with your money belt as if like you're going into just a regular marketplace. And you shouldn't go with dust and dirt on your feet. Your feet should be clean. And you should not make it a shortcut. For example, you want to go from the old city of Jerusalem and you want to go to the other side of the mountain, and Har Zetim. You want to get there, instead you don't want to walk all the way around. You want to cut through, take a shortcut. You're not allowed. The same applies to a Beit Knesset. Sometimes you want to get to the back room, and the easiest way is to go through the sanctuary of the Beit Knesset. That's not permitted. You're using it for your own purposes. All the more so, one should not spit on the Temple Mount and treat it disrespectfully. And so this is what it means. It's not that you have to be, you would not worship and bow down to the stones of the Beit HaMikdash, but rather we treat it with respect. And how do we know that? Because same thing, just like Shabbat. Now I know that this will be true when the Beit HaMikdash is actually there. What if there's no Beit HaMikdash? Do I have to treat Har HaBayit with this level of respect? And the answer is yes. So here's the second thing we're going to learn from the comparison between Shabbat and the Mikdash, that just like Shabbat applies forever. We still keep Shabbat even if there's no Beit HaMikdash, nothing to do with each other. And so too, the respect, a fear that we have of the site of the Beit HaMikdash also applies forever, which is actually a halacha lemaaseh for those who give a psak halacha that say you can go up to Har HaBayit even today, not where the Beit HaMikdash is, but rather on the outskirts, where we know for sure the Beit HaMikdash was not. That still is Har HaBayit. And therefore, if you do go up there, you have to make sure not to wear leather shoes and not to bring your wallet and not to spit and not to use it as a shortcut. And all these still apply even today, and they also apply to a Beit Knesset. Okay, good. So that's what we learned from that pasuk, right? Because we already know that the other rule from honoring parents, and so this is what we can learn from this pasuk. Very good. And so now we're still left with back to the drawing board. We're looking for a derasha that will teach us the rule that aseh is doche, lo ta'aseh, even if it has karet. Because once we find that, then we'll understand why we would have assumed that aseh of yibum is doche lo ta'aseh of arayot that has lav, and that's what I would have thought, and that's why I need the derasha aleha to tell me that in that case, not so. Okay, so here's going to be our last attempt to find Shatze derasha ela sakadatech amina tete mehab ara. Let's learn it from kindling. I'm going to tell you what the argument is. This argument is going to be a bit long, so let me tell you what it is, and then we could see it inside. We're talking about capital punishment overriding Shabbat. If you have a convict, all right, the court decides he's guilty of capital punishment. One type of capital punishment is burning. We don't burn the person alive because that would desecrate the person's body. And even though he's a convict and he's being killed, still it's nice to respect the Selim Elokim, his body, and therefore the Mishnah teaches that burning serefa is done by melting lead and pouring the molten lead down the convict's throat. Also, not very fun, but nevertheless, that's the way it was done. Now, here's the question: can a Beit Din impose capital punishment on Shabbat, even though it would involve burning? In this case, you'd have to melt the metal. You have to make a fire to melt the metal and all that. Or if it was other types of capital punishment, right? Could you stone someone on Shabbat? All these would involve melacha. So is capital punishment more important than Shabbat or not? If we prove that it is, that's what we're going to try to do. Then we'll see misvat aseh. It's a misvat aseh to kill a convict. And if we indeed say it does override Shabbat, then there you go, a misvat aseh that overrides a lo taseh that has karet, because these would be all violations of Shabbat which have karet, and that would be a proof. Okay, that's what we're going to attempt to do. We will disprove it, but let's see what the proof is. Tete mehavara. Tetana deber bishmel lo tevaru esh bechol moshevotechem ma tamud lomar. This baraita asks, quotes the pasuk that says, "Do not burn fire in all of your settlements." And we ask, what does the pasuk teach us? We interrupt the baraita to say, "Ma tamud lomar." What do you mean? What does it teach us? It teaches us some very important things. There's a significant machloket regarding this pasuk and what its use is. Rabbi Yosef says, why does the Torah go out of its way to say that making a fire is not allowed? There's 39 melachot, and the Torah does not list all of them. But this one, it goes out of its way to say, don't make a fire. What's special? Rabbi Yosef says this lighting a fire on Shabbat is special because it's actually less severe than the other 39 melachot. The other 39 melachot, you would get karet and capital punishment for violating Shabbat, but for lighting a fire, it's treated only as a lav, which means someone would get lashes, but would not get capital punishment for doing it on purpose with witnesses, and would not get karet for doing it without witnesses. So that's Rabbi Yosef says burning is less. Rabbi Natan says, why does the Torah go out of its way to specify this one melacha of burning to divide it? It's actually teaching us a general rule about all melachot, that if someone would violate multiple melachot, let's say by mistake, he would have to bring a korban chatat for each and every category. So if someone lit a fire and also planted and also trapped an animal, right, and also wrote 2 letters, and then he would have to bring 4 korban chatat for every category of melacha. And so it specifies one to teach me that punishment is deserving even for violating only one, and you have to bring a korban chatat for each and every one. Okay, so Rabbi Natan would treat burning fire as a full-fledged melacha equal to all the others. Rabbi Yosef says it's a lesser melacha. And where do we know that? From this baraita, the Tanya habara lelav yasata, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Natan omer lechalek. Okay, so this is the end of the interruption. Ma tamud lomar, what do you mean? Lo tevaru esh teaches us very important things. One or the other, it teaches something essential. Tana moshavot kakashele. Oh, here's the question. What we meant to ask was, why does it have to say bechol moshevotechem? You could have just said lo tevaru esh, do not burn a fire. Why does it have to say throughout your habitations? Right? Like where else am I going to burn a fire? In space? So moshavot matamud lomar. What does that word come to ask? Mikedi Shabbat. This is explaining still the question. Mikedi Shabbat chovat hagufi. וחובת הגוף נוהגת בין בארץ בין בחוץ לארץ. מושבות תכתב לחמנה בשבת. למה לי? Shabbat, after all, is an obligation of the body, me, all right? It's an obligation that is imposed on a person, and any obligation imposed on a person applies both in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel, as opposed to prohibitions that apply to a land, like Shivi'it. Do not farm on a Shivi'it year. That has to do with land. Therefore, that would apply only in Israel, not outside the land of Israel. But any mitzvah, like Shabbat, that applies to the person, that's something that I cannot do, applies everywhere. And so there's no reason why I would think that Shabbat would not apply in all habitations. Of course, it applies everywhere you live. So why does the pasuk come to add that? Okay. So now the student of Rabbi Ishmael is going to explain what Rabbi Ishmael said about it. Pasuk in Devarim says, if a person is deserving of capital punishment, then you must kill him. It sounds like this is a blanket statement, misvat aseh, across the board, that we would impose capital punishment on a weekday or on Shabbat, right? If that's when we found him guilty, that's when we would kill him. Now, on the other hand, we have a pasuk that says, anyone who violates Shabbat, it deserves capital punishment, meaning this is a lo ta'aseh, don't violate Shabbat. And so if it says don't violate Shabbat, I might think that that is a blanket statement across the board. Never violate Shabbat. So when does that apply? Bishar melachot. Maybe that applies in other contexts, except for capital punishment, right? So I might think that I apply the mitzvah ta'aseh across the board, give capital punishment, even on Shabbat. When it says do not violate Shabbat, that's just regarding other matters, but does not apply to capital punishment. That would be one side. Or maybe the prohibition against doing melacha on Shabbat applies even to a betin giving capital punishment. And it says vehumat, I know I have to give capital punishment, but that mitzvat aseh applies only in a weekday and not on Shabbat. So these are the two sides. Then the Beraita goes back to the first side and says, or maybe it is even on Shabbat. Okay, this is a bit unusual for a Beraita. It's typical of a Midrash Halacha to present one side, then say, what about the other side? And then prove not, then prove it. But to go back and forth twice is unusual. The daf tomorrow is going to pick up in this very question. How come it says, and then again, another, All right, well, so we'll leave that for now. But here the question is, well, which way is it? Can you do it even on Shabbat? Tamud Omar, lo tevaru esh bechol moshevotechem. Ulhalanu omer, v'hayu ele lachem lechukat mishpat ledorotechem bechol moshevotechem. Okay, so here the word moshevotechem appears in two different contexts. We're going to make a gezerah shava. On the one hand, you cannot light a fire, and it says in all of your settlements. But the other pasuk that is dealing with murderers says this should be the law for generations in all of your settlements. So this is saying this lo tevaru esh is not only about kindling fire in general, just if you want to, light a cigarette or something. It's talking about also making a fire in order to oppose the capital punishment of serefa. And it addresses b'chol moshevotechem to say, even if it is capital punishment. Ma moshavot amarim lahalan bebetin. See this word moshavot, you can tell from the context that says you should deal with murderers forever, everywhere you live. What do you mean everywhere you live? It means in the betin, right? The betin is commanded, that's the betin's job, is commanded to bring murderers to judgment. So the word moshavotechem means betin. So this word bechol moshevotechem, we are now using the cipher to explain that it means in the context of a betin giving capital punishment, and it says do not light a fire even if it's a betin imposing capital punishment. And so there we go. The lo ta'aseh overrides the aseh in this case, but we need a darasha for it, right? Which would mean that otherwise it would be the aseh that overrides the lo ta'aseh, even though it has karet. Okay, that's where the argument is going. Another couple of steps to it. My lav de binatanhi, and now remember that lo tevaru esh itself was subject to a machloket whether it is a full-fledged melacha or not. And so let's assume with Rabbi Natan that it is a full-fledged melacha that has karet, because Rabbi Natan says why does the Torah specify don't light a fire? To teach me that every single melacha is divided and is its own entity. And so therefore, since according to the Binatan, doing a melacha of lighting a fire does deserve karet, and the only reason that we do not impose capital punishment on Shabbat is because of this special pasuk that says lo tevaru esh bechol moshevotechem. If not for that pasuk, then I would have assumed that we do impose capital punishment, and that's a mitzvah taseh that would override Shabbat even with a lav. And now we have our proof. Okay, sounds good. But then we say, oh, remember the Biyoseh? Maybe it's the Biyoseh. The Biyoseh said lighting a fire is not a lav of karet and does not have capital punishment. It's just a regular one. And so then in that case, I would not be able to learn it. No, we're going to save the day even for the Biyoseh. Habara de betin bishul petilahu. No, when the Yosef said that lighting a fire is only a regular lav that just gets lashes and does not get any special punishment, that's only referring to actually lighting the match or rubbing two stones together, only that act. But if I would cook also, that's another melacha. For sure, cooking was going to be a full melacha. And in order to kill someone with capital punishment, not only do you have to light a fire, you're also going to have to melt the metal. And that would be cooking, and therefore it would involve full-fledged melacha. And yet, the Rabbi Yosef would say, if not for the derasha, I would have thought it's allowed. And if I thought it was allowed, that would be a case of aseh, toche, lo taseh, with karet. And so therefore we have a good proof both for the Binatan and for the Yosef. All right. We wish we could end there, but not so fast. Oh, that's just an explanation of what we just said. That there's no difference between cooking a wick or cooking herbs that you eat, or cooking the wick, cooking the metal that is going to be used is the same thing. And therefore, that would show that according to the Yosef, we still have a proof. And so right now, we do have a proof that if not for this derasha, this would be a case that capital punishment would override Shabbat, and that's naseh doche lo taseh, even with a lav. But we reject this argument. Amarav Shimi bar Asher. Haitana la mishum da'ate aseh v'dache lo taseh. No, this baraita. The reason why it was assuming that capital punishment would override Shabbat was not because of a rule of aseh lo ta'aseh, but rather ela mishum de'maiteh mikal v'chomer, because without the derasha, he would have had a kal v'chomer to prove that capital punishment is more important than Shabbat. What's the kal v'chomer? Rachi kamar mani mekayem echad lehamot yumat bishar melachot chus b'mitat betin. When it says do not violate Shabbat, that's referring to other matters and not capital punishment. But I would have thought that capital punishment does override Shabbat based on the following kal v'chomer. Uma avodah shehi chamura v'docha Shabbat. The service of the Beit haMikdash is so stringent that it overrides Shabbat. Right, we bring korban tamid, korban musaf on Shabbat, which involves killing animals, burning them, making fires, and so a temple service overrides Shabbat. And yet, taking care of a murderer, punishing a murderer, overrides the temple service, because the pasuk says, if a murderer runs away to the Beit haMikdash and tries to seek refuge in the Beit haMikdash, we do not let him. This was an ancient law that someone who's in Beit haMikdash, he's in holy space. It's like he's like on home base. He's safe. The Torah says, no way, right? Murderer is such a terrible thing that you take him right off of them, even if he's holding the mizbeach, you take him away, which would mean that even, let's say he's a kohen, a murderer kohen, who's on the run, and he runs to the Beit haMikdash and he's serving in the Beit haMikdash, and he's doing everything there, and maybe he's the only kohen around that day. What would we do? We would come and we would remove him from the Beit haMikdash and give him capital punishment, even if it means that the temple service would be overridden. And so you see that killing a murderer overrides even the temple service. And the temple service overrides Shabbat. So all the more so, Shabbat, so Shabbat, which is less than temple service, all the more so that killing a murderer would override Shabbat, right? Killing a murderer overrides avodah, and avodah overrides Shabbat. So all the more so, if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then certainly A is greater than C. And this is the kal v'chomer. So if I had no derasha, I would assume that the court can impose capital punishment even on Shabbat because of the kal v'chomer, and that's the derasha comes to say, no, not so. But that's why I would have assumed that, and not because of the rule of aseh doche lo ta'aseh with karet. So in the end, we do not have any source for this. And then we bring up the question of why do we need the derasha of aleha? Because even without the derasha of aleha, I could have assumed that the lo ta'aseh of karet, of arayot, of marrying two sisters, would be more significant than the aseh of Yevamot. And so we'll have to wait to find an answer to that question. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen v'amen.